Sometimes the most devastating words aren't screamed in anger, they're whispered with a smile, thinking no one will notice the cruelty hidden beneath. Let me tell you about the Thanksgiving that changed everything. Not because of what happened at dinner, but because of what happened when I wasn't invited to it. My name is Harold, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived through 7 decades of family gatherings, holiday traditions, and the slow, inevitable changes that come with watching your children grow into adults with families of their own. What I wasn't prepared for was the moment when tradition would be used as a weapon against me. It started 3 weeks before Thanksgiving 2023. I was in my kitchen, going through my recipe box, the same wooden box my late wife Margaret had used for 43 years of marriage. I was looking for her famous stuffing recipe, the one that had been the centerpiece of our family Thanksgivings since our son Timothy was old enough to sit at the big table. Timothy, my boy who's now 47, married to a lovely woman named Catherine, father to 2 beautiful children, Lily, age 12, and Benjamin, age 9. For the past 5 years since Margaret passed, we'd maintained our tradition. Timothy and Catherine would host, I'd bring the stuffing and my homemade cranberry sauce, and we'd spend the day the way families are supposed to together. I was particularly excited about this year's gathering because I had news to share. After months of consideration and paperwork, I'd finally decided to set up trust funds for my grandchildren's education. Lily was already showing exceptional promise in mathematics, and Benjamin had inherited his grandmother's artistic talents. I wanted to secure their futures, to give them opportunities I'd never had growing up during the lean years of the 1950s, but first I needed to coordinate the meal. Catherine had always been wonderful about including me in the planning, understanding that these traditions weren't just about food, they were about connection, about honoring Margaret's memory, about showing my grandchildren that family meant something. I picked up my phone and called Timothy. The conversation started normally enough. "Hey, Dad," Timothy answered, though his voice seemed slightly strained. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm doing well, son. I was going through your mother's recipes and wanted to coordinate with Catherine about Thursday. Should I plan on bringing the usual?" There was a pause. A pause that in hindsight should have warned me, but at 72 you learn to interpret silences differently. Sometimes they're just people gathering their thoughts, sometimes they're people checking their calendars, sometimes they're people gathering courage to break your heart. "Actually, Dad, about that," Timothy's voice took on that careful tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients at his law firm. "Catherine and I have been talking, and we've decided to keep things small this year." "Small?" I asked, genuinely confused. "It's just the 5 of us, same as always." Another pause, this one longer. "Well, that's just it. We're thinking really small, just Catherine, the kids, and me. You know how chaotic it can get, and with Catherine's parents visiting next month for Christmas, we thought it might be nice to have a quiet, simple Thanksgiving." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I've learned something in 7 decades of living. Dignity is often measured not by what you say, but by what you don't say. "I see," I replied quietly. "That sounds nice for you all. You understand, right, Dad? It's nothing personal. We just want to keep it low-key this year." Nothing personal. As if excluding your elderly father from the family's most important gathering could be anything but personal. As if the man who'd taught you to carve a turkey, who'd sat at that same table for 48 consecutive Thanksgivings, who'd been planning to share news about securing your children's futures, as if that person could be removed from the equation without it being personal. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said, "Of course, Timothy, I understand completely." "Thanks, Dad, I knew you would. Maybe we can get together the weekend after. We could do a casual lunch or something." A casual lunch, to replace 48 years of tradition. To replace what should have been the first Thanksgiving where I announced that Lily and Benjamin's college educations were fully funded, where I shared my pride in how well they were both doing in school, where I continued the traditions their grandmother had started. "That sounds fine, son. You have a wonderful Thanksgiving." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at Margaret's recipe box. The house felt different somehow, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with the sudden absence of anticipation. I won't lie to you, it hurt. At 72, you've experienced enough loss to recognize the different varieties of pain. There's the sharp, clean pain of obvious cruelty, the dull ache of gradual neglect, and then there's this, the sophisticated pain of being discarded politely, with consideration for everyone's feelings except your own. But here's what I've learned about dignity over the years: it's not about never feeling hurt. It's about what you do with that hurt once you feel it. I closed Margaret's recipe box and put it away. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I started making plans for myself. You see, when you reach my age, you accumulate certain advantages that younger people don't always recognize. Resources, yes, but more importantly, perspective. You understand that every action creates consequences, that every choice reveals character, and that sometimes the most powerful response to exclusion is simply accepting it completely. Over the next few days, I began making quiet Arrangements. First I called my attorney, James Morrison, a man roughly Timothy's age who'd handled my affairs since Margaret's passing. James had always been respectful, professional, and most importantly, he'd never once suggested that my age made me less capable of making my own decisions. Harold, James greeted me warmly when I arrived at his office. Good to see you. How can I help you today? I need to make some changes to my estate planning, James, some significant changes. I explained the situation carefully, without editorial commentary or emotional manipulation. Just the facts. My son had decided to exclude me from family gatherings going forward, beginning with Thanksgiving. I no longer felt comfortable maintaining the same financial arrangements I'd had in place. I understand, James nodded. What specifically did you have in mind? First, I want to establish those education trusts for the grandchildren we discussed, but I want them managed entirely through your firm with no family involvement required. The children should benefit from their grandmother's hard work and my savings, regardless of their parents' choices. That's very generous, Harold. Second, I want to revise my will. Timothy was set to inherit the house and the bulk of my assets. I think it's time to consider other options. James leaned forward slightly. Are you certain about this? Family disputes can be resolved. This isn't a dispute, James. This is a decision. My son has chosen to simplify his life by removing me from it. I'm simply respecting that choice and planning accordingly. We spent the next 2 hours restructuring everything. The house would go to a charity that supported elderly veterans, men and women who understood the value of service and sacrifice. The bulk of my financial assets would be divided between several organizations I'd supported quietly for years: the local food bank, the children's hospital, the literacy program at the public library. Timothy would still receive something, a modest inheritance that would cover any immediate needs but wouldn't change his life substantially. Enough to know he hadn't been forgotten, not enough to regret his choices too deeply. But the most important change was the establishment of the education trusts for Lily and Benjamin. They would be fully funded enough for undergraduate degrees, graduate school if they chose, even trade schools or artistic pursuits. The children would never need to worry about the cost of their education, but Timothy and Catherine would never be able to access or control those funds. The trusts will become active when each child turns 18, I explained to James. Until then, they remain anonymous. The children will receive a letter on their 18th birthdays explaining that their grandmother and grandfather wanted to ensure their educational futures were secure. And if Timothy asks about changes to your estate, he won't, I replied quietly. To ask would require admitting that he'd considered my death enough to wonder about inheritance. I don't think he's quite there yet. The paperwork took several days to complete properly. During that time, I found myself settling into a different rhythm of life. For years, so much of my energy had been directed toward maintaining family connections, making sure I remained relevant and included in Timothy's life. Suddenly, I had all that energy available for other pursuits. I started volunteering at the Veterans Center downtown 3 days a week, helping older veterans navigate benefits paperwork and medical appointments. The work was meaningful, and I discovered something interesting. When you're genuinely helpful to people who appreciate your assistance, you don't feel old or burdensome. You feel valuable. I also began attending a book club at the library, something Margaret had always encouraged me to try, but I'd never found time for while maintaining family obligations. The group met every Thursday evening, and I was surprised to find how much I enjoyed the discussions, how sharp my mind felt when engaged with new ideas and different perspectives. But the most significant change was in my living situation. The house felt too large for one person, too filled with memories that now seemed to emphasize absence rather than presence. After discussing it with James, I decided to put it on the market and move to a senior living community about 20 miles away, not because I needed assistance, but because I wanted the social engagement and the freedom from home maintenance. Sunset Manor wasn't what most people picture when they think of senior living. It was more like a small town designed for people who'd earned the right to focus on living rather than maintaining. Individual apartments, shared common areas, optional meal plans, and most importantly, a community of people who understood that aging didn't mean disappearing. I put the house on the market the week before Thanksgiving. The realtor, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, was optimistic about a quick sale. The neighborhood had appreciated significantly over the years, and the house itself was in excellent condition thanks to Margaret's meticulous care and my own maintenance efforts. Are you sure about the timeline, Mr. Harrison? Patricia asked. Moving during the holidays can be stressful. I'm quite sure, I replied. I'd prefer to start fresh in the new year. As Thanksgiving approached, I found myself feeling surprisingly peaceful about the entire situation. I'd made arrangements to volunteer at the community center, serving dinner to families who couldn't afford their own celebrations. It seemed like a better use of the day than sitting alone in my house, thinking about empty chairs and broken traditions. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke early and prepared for the day ahead. I'd always been an early riser, a habit developed during my years working in manufacturing before I'd moved into management and eventually started my own small consulting firm. The quiet morning hours had always been my favorite time for reflection and planning. As I was getting dressed, my phone rang. For just a moment my heart lifted, thinking perhaps Timothy had reconsidered, perhaps the family had decided they missed me after all. It was Timothy, but not with the message I'd hoped for. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice carrying that same careful tone from our previous conversation. "I just wanted to call and wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Catherine and I were talking, and we want you to know we're thinking of you today." "Thank you, son, that's very thoughtful. What are your plans for the day? I hope you're not just sitting around the house." I could hear the guilt in his voice, the attempt to assuage his conscience without actually changing his choices. It was a familiar pattern not unique to Timothy, but common among people who want to feel better about their decisions without examining whether those decisions were right. "Actually, I'm volunteering at the community center today. We're serving dinner to about 200 families." Oh, Timothy sounded genuinely surprised. That's really great, Dad. I didn't know you were involved with the community center. There are a lot of things about my life you don't know, Timothy. "But that's understandable. We haven't spent much time together lately." Another pause. I could practically hear him processing the gentle rebuke. "Well, maybe after the holidays we can." "Timothy," I interrupted quietly, "enjoy your small Thanksgiving. Give my love to Catherine and the children. Dad, have a wonderful day, son." I ended the call before he could say anything else that might require me to comfort him about his choices. That's another thing you learn with age. You're not obligated to make other people feel better about the ways they hurt you. The day at the community center was genuinely fulfilling. I worked alongside volunteers of all ages, serving turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce to families who were grateful for the meal and the company. There was something deeply satisfying about being useful, about contributing to something larger than family politics and hurt feelings. One of the other volunteers, a woman named Ruth who appeared to be roughly my age, worked beside me for most of the afternoon. She had the kind of competent efficiency that spoke of years spent managing households and organizing community events. "First time volunteering here?" she asked during a brief lull between serving shifts. "Yes, and you?" "Oh, I've been coming for about 3 years now, ever since my husband passed. It beats sitting alone wondering why my children are all too busy for an old woman." Her directness surprised me, but I appreciated it. It's remarkable how invisible we can become, isn't it? "Invisible or inconvenient," Ruth replied with a slight smile. "Though I've found that once you stop trying so hard to be convenient, life becomes much more interesting." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, and I found myself thinking about her words. Stop trying so hard to be convenient. For years, I'd shaped my schedule around Timothy's family, my interests around their needs, my expectations around their comfort levels. When had I become so small in my own life? After the community center closed that evening, I drove home to my quiet house and spent the evening reading. It was a peaceful Thanksgiving, different from what I'd expected, but not unpleasant. Sometimes change, even unwelcome change, can reveal possibilities you hadn't considered. The weeks following Thanksgiving passed quickly. The house sold faster than Patricia had expected, a young family with 2 small children, drawn to the neighborhood schools and the large backyard where Margaret had grown her famous tomatoes. They made an offer within days of the listing, and we scheduled closing for mid-December. I began packing systematically, room by room, deciding what would move with me to Sunset Manor and what needed to be donated or discarded. It was a process that required emotional discipline. 48 years of marriage and family life accumulates an enormous amount of physical and emotional history. In Margaret's closet, I found the dress she'd worn to Timothy's wedding, still wrapped in plastic from the dry cleaner. In the basement, I discovered boxes of school projects and report cards, evidence of Timothy's childhood achievements that Margaret had carefully preserved. In the garage, I found the tools I'd used to build Lily's playhouse 3 summers ago, when she'd been 9 and still thought her grandfather could build anything. Each discovery was a small grief, a reminder of connections that had felt permanent but proved to be more fragile than I'd understood. But grief, I'd learned from Margaret's death, isn't something you overcome so much as something you incorporate. It becomes part of your wisdom, part of your understanding of what matters and what doesn't. I was in the middle of packing Margaret's china, the set we'd received as a wedding gift and had used for every holiday meal since when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Timothy's car in the driveway. He stood on the porch looking uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot in a way that reminded me of the boy he'd been when he needed to confess some minor misbehavior. "Dad," he said when I opened the door, "I hope it's okay that I stopped by. I tried calling, but come in, Timothy." I stepped aside to let him enter. "Can I get you coffee?" "Sure, that would be great." He followed me to the kitchen, where boxes labeled china and glassware made it obvious that significant changes were underway. "Dad, what's all this? Are you packing?" I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him at the table where we'd shared countless meals. Conversations and family meetings over the years. I'm moving, Timothy. The house sold last week. His face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been panic. Moving where? Why didn't you tell me you were thinking about this? I'm moving to Sunset Manor, that senior living community about 20 miles north, and I didn't mention it because it didn't seem like something that would affect your life significantly. Timothy stared at me for a long moment. Dad, this is a huge decision. Don't you think we should have discussed it? This is where I grew up. This is where this is where your mother and I built our life together, yes, but I'm not your mother, Timothy, and apparently I'm not part of your life in the same way she was. That's not fair, Dad. Just because we decided to keep Thanksgiving small doesn't mean— Timothy, I said gently, let's be honest with each other. When was the last time you called just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my life, my interests, my health? When was the last time you included me in any family decision or even informed me about changes in your lives? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. I'm not angry about this, I continued. I'm just accepting reality. You've built a life that doesn't have much room for me in it, and that's understandable. You have your own family, your own priorities, your own concerns. But that means I need to build a life that doesn't depend on occasional inclusion in yours. But Dad, selling the house, moving away, this feels so final. It's not punishment, son, it's just practical. This house is too large for one person, too expensive to maintain, and too full of memories that now emphasize what I've lost rather than what I had. Sunset Manor offers community, activities, and the chance to build new friendships with people who are dealing with similar life transitions. Timothy looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze settled on the boxes of china. What about Mom's things? What about all the family stuff? The things that are specifically yours, your school projects, your childhood photos, gifts you gave us over the years. I've boxed those separately. You can take them today if you'd like. Everything else will be donated or disposed of appropriately. But what about when Lily and Benjamin are older? What if they want to see where their dad grew up? What if they want Grandma's china or her jewelry? It was a fair question, and I could see that Timothy was beginning to understand the broader implications of the changes I was making. Timothy, your children are 12 and 9. In the 6 months since school started, how many times have they asked to see me? How many times have you brought them by for a visit? He was quiet for a long moment. We've been busy with their activities, and you know Catherine's been dealing with her mother's health issues. I'm not criticizing your priorities, son. I'm just pointing out that my presence or absence in your lives has already been established. I'm simply adjusting my living situation to match the reality of our relationship. We sat in silence for several minutes. Timothy stared into his coffee cup while I waited to see what he would say next. Sometimes the most important conversations require patience, the willingness to let uncomfortable truths settle into recognition. Dad, he finally said, I think maybe Catherine and I made a mistake about Thanksgiving. Maybe you did. We could do Christmas differently. We could make sure you're included in everything. We could go back to the way things were. I looked at my son, this middle-aged man with graying temples and worry lines around his eyes, and felt a deep sadness for both of us. He was trying to undo something that couldn't be undone, trying to return to a dynamic that had already been fundamentally altered. Timothy, you can't go back to the way things were because the way things were was already broken. I was already becoming peripheral to your family's life. Thanksgiving was just the moment when that reality became undeniable. So what are you saying, that we can't fix this? I'm saying that fixing it would require changes that I don't think you're prepared to make, and changes that I'm no longer interested in making. Timothy's face flushed slightly. What does that mean? It means that for years I've adjusted my expectations, my schedule, my interests, and my social life to accommodate your family's needs and preferences. I've been grateful for whatever inclusion you offered whenever you offered it. I've been careful not to be demanding, not to be burdensome, not to be inconvenient. I paused, choosing my words carefully. But I'm 72 years old, Timothy. I don't have time to spend the rest of my life waiting for invitations that may or may not come, hoping for phone calls that may or may not happen, wondering whether I'm welcome at family gatherings or whether I'm just being tolerated. Dad, that's not— Son, I love you. I will always love you. But I can't continue organizing my life around the hope that you'll eventually have room for me in yours. I need to build a life that's fulfilling on its own terms, with people who genuinely want my company and value my presence. Timothy sat back in his chair, looking genuinely shaken. I never thought about it that way. I know you didn't, and that's part of the problem. We talked for another hour, covering practical details about the move, the disposition of family belongings, and the logistics of maintaining contact once I was living at Sunset Manor. Timothy seemed to be processing not just the immediate changes, but the broader implications of what our relationship had become and what it might be in the future. Before he left, he asked one more question that revealed he was beginning to understand the fuller scope of the changes I was making. Dad, what about— we've never talked about your will or anything, but with you moving and making all these changes, should I be concerned about anything? It was a delicate question, asked by a man who was trying to balance genuine concern with natural anxiety about inheritance. I appreciated that he'd asked directly rather than trying to approach the subject sideways. Your mother and I always planned to leave everything to you and the grandchildren, Timothy. Recent events have caused me to reconsider some of those arrangements. His face went pale. What kind of reconsiderations? I've established education trusts for Lily and Benjamin that will fully fund their college educations, regardless of what they choose to study or where they choose to go. Those trusts are irrevocable and will be managed independently. Timothy nodded slowly. That's incredibly generous, Dad. As for the rest, I've decided to distribute the bulk of my assets to various charitable organizations that have been meaningful to me over the years. You'll still inherit something, but it won't be the substantial inheritance your mother and I originally planned. The silence that followed this announcement was profound. I watched Timothy work through the implications, the calculations, the recognition that his choices had consequences he hadn't anticipated. Is this because of Thanksgiving? He finally asked. It's because of Thanksgiving and Christmas last year when you forgot to call, and my birthday when you sent a card but didn't visit, and the fact that I haven't had a real conversation with my grandchildren in months despite living 20 minutes away from them. Dad, Timothy, I'm not trying to hurt you or punish you, but I've realized that waiting for my family to value me isn't a sustainable way to live the rest of my life. I'd rather use whatever resources I have to support causes and organizations that are already making a difference in the world. Timothy left that afternoon looking shell-shocked, and I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I'd never wanted our relationship to reach this point. Relief because I'd finally stopped pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The closing on the house went smoothly, and I moved into Sunset Manor 3 days before Christmas. My new apartment was smaller than the house but perfectly adequate for my needs. 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping, one set up as a study and reading room, a small kitchen, a living area with large windows overlooking gardens that would be beautiful in spring. But the real revelation was the community itself. Within a week, I'd been invited to join a poker game, recruited for the community garden committee, and asked to participate in a discussion group focused on current events and political analysis. These were people who'd lived full lives, who had stories to tell and insights to share, who understood that aging was just another phase of existence rather than a withdrawal from life. Ruth, the woman I'd met at Thanksgiving dinner, lived in the apartment building next to mine. She became a regular walking partner, and our conversations ranged from books and movies to family relationships and the challenges of aging gracefully. You seem much more settled than when I first met you, she observed one morning as we walked the path that wound through the community's grounds. I feel more settled. It's remarkable how much energy you expend trying to maintain relationships that aren't working. What's happening with your son? I told Ruth the general outline of my situation, and she'd shared similar stories about her own children's gradual drift away from regular contact and inclusion. He calls more often now, I admitted. Ever since he found out about the will changes, he's also started bringing the grandchildren by for visits. How do you feel about that? It was a perceptive question. Timothy's increased attention had been noticeable and frankly a bit uncomfortable. His visits felt obligatory rather than natural, motivated by anxiety about inheritance rather than genuine interest in my well-being. I feel sad about it, I said honestly. I'd rather have authentic distance than artificial closeness motivated by financial concerns. Have you told him that? Not directly. But I've been clear that the will changes aren't negotiable, regardless of how our relationship develops going forward. Ruth nodded approvingly. It's important to remove that dynamic from the equation. Otherwise, you'll never know whether his attention is genuine. Christmas came and went quietly. Timothy and Catherine invited me to their celebration, but I declined gracefully, choosing instead to attend Sunset Manor's holiday party and volunteer again at the community center. It felt more authentic than participating in a family gathering where my presence was motivated by guilt rather than genuine welcome. January brought the paperwork finalizing all the legal and financial changes I'd made. The education trusts were fully funded and legally irrevocable. My revised will was signed and witnessed. The charitable organizations I'd chosen to support had been notified that they would be beneficiaries of my estate. I felt lighter somehow, freed from the weight of expectations that hadn't been serving anyone well. For the first time in years, I was living entirely for myself, pursuing interests because I enjoyed them, building relationships because they were mutually rewarding, making plans based on what I wanted to do rather than what others might need from me. Spring arrived early that year, and the community gardens at Sunset Manor burst into bloom with remarkable beauty. I'd volunteered to help maintain the vegetable garden, work that reminded me of the hours I'd spent with Margaret tending our own backyard garden, but this was different, a shared project with people who appreciated the effort and the results equally. It was while I was working in the garden one warm April morning that I received the phone call that changed everything again. Grandpa Harold, the voice was young, uncertain, but unmistakably Lily's. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, genuinely delighted to hear from her. How are you? I'm okay. Grandpa, I wanted to ask you something, but I don't want to get in trouble. My heart clenched at the implication that she might get in trouble for talking to me. What is it, honey? Why don't you come to our house anymore? Mom says you're busy with your new friends, but I miss talking to you. And Benjamin misses the stories you used to tell him. The directness of children can be both heartbreaking and illuminating. Here was the truth that the adults had been dancing around for months, expressed simply by a 12-year-old girl who just wanted to understand why her grandfather had disappeared from her life. Lily, I miss talking to you too, more than you know. Then why don't you visit us anymore? Did we do something wrong? How do you explain adult complications to a child without damaging her relationship with her parents? How do you be honest without being hurtful? You and Benjamin didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that affect the whole family, and everyone has to figure out how to adjust to those decisions. But couldn't you just come over anyway, like you used to? It's a little more complicated than that, honey. But I want you to know that I think about you and Benjamin every day, and I'm very proud of both of you. We talked for a few more minutes about her school projects and Benjamin's latest artwork. She told me about the science fair she was entering and asked if I remembered teaching her about plant biology when she was younger. Of course I remembered. I remembered every conversation, every shared moment, every time she'd looked at me with genuine interest and curiosity. After we hung up, I sat in the garden for a long time, surrounded by the tomato plants I'd been tending. Her call had stirred up emotions I'd been successfully managing for months. The love was still there, unchanged and unwavering. But so was the recognition that loving someone doesn't always mean you can have the relationship you want with them. That evening, Timothy called. His voice was tense, apologetic, and slightly defensive all at once. Dad, Lily told me she called you today. I hope that was okay. She's been asking about you a lot lately, and Catherine and I thought, well, we thought maybe it would be good for her to talk to you directly. It was more than okay, Timothy. It was the best part of my day. She's been really persistent about wanting to see you. She keeps asking when you're coming back to visit. I could hear the discomfort in his voice, the recognition that he'd created a situation that was harder to explain to his children than he'd anticipated. What do you tell her? We've been saying that you're busy getting settled in your new home, making new friends. But she's smart, Dad. She knows that doesn't explain why you haven't been around for months. No, it doesn't. Another pause. Timothy was clearly struggling with how to navigate this conversation. Dad, Catherine and I have been talking, and we think maybe we made some mistakes. Maybe we were too quick to change things, too focused on what seemed convenient rather than what was right. Maybe you were. Would you be open to having the kids visit you sometime at your new place? They've never seen where you live now, and Lily especially seems curious about it. It was a reasonable request and one that I'd been hoping for. Despite everything that had happened between Timothy and me, my love for my grandchildren remained uncomplicated and pure. They hadn't chosen the exclusion, they'd simply been caught in the wake of their parents' decisions. I'd love to have them visit, Timothy, anytime. What about this Saturday? We could drive them over in the morning, maybe stay for lunch. I hesitated. Having Timothy and Catherine at Sunset Manor felt complicated in a way that having just the children didn't. Their presence would change the dynamic, make it about adult relationships and unresolved tensions rather than simply enjoying time with my grandchildren. Timothy, I'd prefer to start with just Lily and Benjamin if that's all right. I want them to feel comfortable here, to see it as a place where they're welcome without the complications of adult conversations. Oh, Timothy sounded slightly hurt. I mean, if that's what you prefer. It's not about preference, son. It's about what's best for them. They need to know that their relationship with me isn't dependent on your relationship with me. They need to understand that they have their own connection to their grandfather, separate from whatever issues the adults might be working through. Timothy was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear him processing this perspective. You're right, he said finally. That makes sense. Catherine and I could drop them off in the morning and pick them up after lunch. That would be perfect. Saturday arrived bright and clear, and I found myself more excited than I'd been in months. I'd planned activities that I thought would interest both children: a tour of the community gardens, a visit to the workshop where some residents built birdhouses and small furniture projects, lunch at the community dining room where they could meet some of my new friends. When Timothy's car pulled up to the main building, I watched through the window as Lily and Benjamin climbed out, looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity that children bring to new places. They'd both grown since I'd last seen them, Lily taller and more composed, Benjamin still energetic but with a new maturity in his posture. Grandpa, Benjamin ran toward me as soon as he spotted me in the lobby. This place is huge. It's pretty big, I agreed, catching him in a hug that felt like coming home. There are lots of interesting things to see here. Lily approached more cautiously, but her smile was genuine and warm. At 12, she was beginning to develop the social awareness that comes with adolescence, the recognition that adult relationships could be complicated in ways she didn't fully understand. "Hi, Grandpa," she said, accepting my hug but also studying my face as if trying to determine whether I was different somehow. "Hello, sweetheart, you look so grown up. How's 7th grade treating you?" "It's okay. Harder than last year, but I like my math teacher. She says I might be able to take algebra next year if I keep working hard." "That's wonderful, Lily. Your grandmother would be so proud of how well you're doing in school." Timothy and Catherine stood by their car, clearly uncertain about the protocol for this new arrangement. I walked over to speak with them briefly. "We'll be fine," I assured them. "I'll have them back here by 3 o'clock. Are you sure you don't want us to stay?" Catherine asked. "We don't mind, I'm sure. This will give the children and me a chance to really talk without distractions." Catherine nodded, though she looked slightly uncomfortable with the idea of leaving her children with me for several hours. It was a telling reaction. When had I become someone who required supervision around my own grandchildren? The morning with Lily and Benjamin was revelatory. Away from the dynamics of family gatherings and parental oversight, they relaxed into the natural, easy relationship we'd always had. Benjamin was fascinated by the workshop and spent nearly an hour learning to use the tools under the careful supervision of Walter, a retired carpenter who volunteered his time teaching other residents. Lily was more interested in the library and the quiet reading rooms where some residents gathered for book discussions and writing workshops. She met Alina, a former English teacher who'd been encouraging me to try writing memoir pieces about my experiences. "Your grandfather has led a very interesting life," Alina told Lily. "He was telling us about the consulting business he built from nothing and about some of the places he traveled for work." Lily looked at me with surprise. "You traveled a lot for work, Grandpa." "Quite a bit, actually. Before you were born, your grandmother and I went to some fascinating places for business conferences and consulting projects." "Where did you go?" I told her about the paper mill in Oregon where I'd spent 3 months helping them redesign their efficiency systems, about the manufacturing plant in North Carolina where I'd implemented new quality control processes, about the business conference in San Francisco where I'd presented research that was later published in an industry journal. "I didn't know you did all that," Lily said, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. "There are lots of things about your grandfather's life that happened before you were old enough to hear about them," Alina said gently. "That's true for everyone's grandparents." During lunch in the community dining room, both children were polite and engaged with the other residents who joined our table. Ruth was particularly charming with them, asking about their school activities and sharing stories about her own grandchildren, who lived across the country and visited rarely. "Your grandfather has become quite popular around here," Ruth told them. "He's helped several of us navigate complicated Medicare paperwork, and he's been invaluable in organizing our community garden project." "Grandpa's really smart about organizing things," Benjamin said proudly. "He helped me build a really cool fort in our backyard before." He trailed off, suddenly realizing that he was referring to activities that no longer happened, relationships that had changed in ways he didn't fully understand. "Before you moved here," Lily finished for him, shooting him a warning look that suggested they'd been coached not to mention certain topics. "That's right," I said simply. "I helped with lots of projects at your old house. Now I help with projects here." After lunch, we walked through the gardens, and I showed them the section where I'd been working with the tomatoes and herbs. Benjamin was amazed by the size of the tomato plants, and Lily was interested in the systematic way the garden was organized and maintained. "It's like a science experiment," she observed. "Everything is so carefully planned." "Good observation. Gardening is very scientific when you do it right. You have to think about soil composition, drainage, sun exposure, companion planting." We spent the afternoon talking about plants and science and the projects they were working on at school. It was the kind of relaxed, educational conversation that I'd always treasured with them, the opportunity to share knowledge and watch their minds engage with new ideas. As our time together was winding down, Lily asked the question I'd been expecting but dreading. "Grandpa, are you ever going to come back to our house?" I sat down on one of the garden benches and looked at both children seriously. They deserved honesty, but they also deserved protection from adult complications that weren't their responsibility to understand or resolve. "Lily, Benjamin, I want you both to know that my love for you hasn't changed at all. You are both incredibly important to me, and spending today with you has been wonderful. But you're not going to come back to our house," Lily said. It wasn't really a question. "The situation between your parents and me is complicated in ways that don't have anything to do with you. But what I want you to understand is that you're always welcome here. This can be a place where you and I spend time together, where we work on projects and talk about things you're interested in." "Why can't it be both places?" Benjamin asked with the directness that only children possess. "Sometimes, sweetheart, relationships change and everyone has to find new ways to stay connected. This doesn't mean anyone loves anyone less. It just means we might see each other in different ways than we used to." Lily studied my face for a long moment. "Are you happier here, Grandpa?" The question surprised me with its perceptiveness. "Yes, honey, I am. I've made good friends here. I'm involved in activities I enjoy and I feel useful and valued. Then I'm glad you moved here, she said simply. Even if I miss having you at our house. When Timothy and Catherine arrived to pick up the children, both Lily and Benjamin were enthusiastic about their day. They talked excitedly about the people they'd met, the gardens they'd seen, the workshop projects they wanted to try next time. Next time, Timothy asked, looking at me questioningly. If it's all right with you, I'd love to have them visit regularly. Maybe once a month they could spend the morning here, have lunch, work on some projects. That sounds great, Catherine said, and for the first time in months her voice carried genuine warmth rather than polite obligation. They've clearly had a wonderful time. As they were getting ready to leave, Lily hugged me tightly. Grandpa, I'm going to write you a letter about my science fair project. Will you write me back? Of course I will, sweetheart. I'd love to hear all about it. Benjamin was more dramatic in his farewell. Grandpa, I wish you lived closer so we could see you more often. 20 miles isn't very far, Benjamin, and now you know where to find me whenever you want to visit. After they left, I sat in my apartment feeling a profound sense of peace. The day had been successful beyond my hopes, not because it had resolved the larger issues with Timothy and Catherine, but because it had established that my relationship with my grandchildren could exist independently of those issues. Over the following weeks, I kept my promise to correspond with Lily about her science fair project. Her letters were thoughtful and detailed, full of questions about plant biology and experimental design. Benjamin sent drawings of the birdhouse he wanted to build during his next visit, complete with architectural details that showed remarkable creativity for a 9-year-old. Timothy called more frequently, ostensibly to coordinate the children's visits, but often extending the conversations to include updates about work, Catherine's family, or community events. These calls felt different than the obligatory check-ins I'd become accustomed to, more natural, less fraught with unspoken tensions. One evening in May, he called with news that surprised me. Dad, Catherine and I have been talking about something, and we wanted to run it by you. What's that? We're thinking about planning a family vacation this summer. Nothing elaborate, maybe a week at that lake house we used to rent when I was a kid. The one up in the mountains where we used to go fishing. I remembered those vacations fondly. Some of my best memories of Timothy's childhood had been created during those weeks at the lake, teaching him to fish, building campfires, telling stories under the stars while Margaret made s'mores and laughed at our terrible ghost stories. That sounds wonderful for your family, I said carefully. Well, that's the thing. We were wondering if you'd like to join us, for part of the week anyway. The kids have been talking about those lake trips nonstop since we mentioned the possibility. I was quiet for a moment, processing the invitation and what it might mean. Was this genuine inclusion, or another attempt to assuage guilt about the changes in our relationship? Timothy, I appreciate the invitation, but I need to ask you something directly, of course. Are you inviting me because you genuinely want me there, or because you feel like you should invite me? The pause that followed was telling. Timothy was clearly considering how to answer honestly without causing offense. Dad, I think it's a little of both, he said finally. Catherine and I have realized that we made some mistakes in how we handled things. We excluded you in ways that weren't necessary, and we've seen how much the kids miss having you around regularly. And we miss it too. Not everything has to go back to exactly the way it was, but we'd like to find a better balance. One where you're part of our family life without anyone feeling obligated or resentful. It was a thoughtful answer, more honest than I'd expected. Timothy was acknowledging the problems without trying to minimize them, expressing desire for change without making promises he might not be able to keep. What would that look like, practically speaking? I asked. We were thinking you could join us for 3 or 4 days of the week. Enough time to really spend time with the kids, do some fishing, enjoy the lake. But not so much time that anyone feels overwhelmed or obligated to maintain conversation when they'd rather be reading or napping. And you've discussed this with Catherine. It was actually her idea. She said watching the kids interact with you during their visits to Sunset Manor reminded her of how important those relationships are and how much everyone benefits when they're working well. I found myself genuinely moved by the invitation and the thought that had gone into it. This wasn't the desperate attempt to return to previous patterns that I'd been expecting. Instead, it seemed like a mature recognition that relationships could evolve, that family connections could be maintained in new ways that worked better for everyone involved. I'd like that very much, Timothy. Thank you for asking. Really, you'll come? I'll come, but I want to pay my share of the expenses, and I want to drive myself so I can leave if I need to for any reason. Dad, you don't need to, Timothy. This is important to me. I want to participate as an independent adult, not as someone who needs to be taken care of or managed. If we're going to build a better relationship, it needs to be based on mutual respect, not obligation. I understand. And I think that's exactly right. The lake vacation, when it happened in July, was one of the most pleasant weeks I'd had with my family in years. The changed dynamic served everyone well. I arrived on Wednesday and stayed through Saturday, joining the family for meals and activities, but also maintaining my own space and schedule. Benjamin was thrilled to have a fishing partner again, and we spent hours on the dock talking about everything from school to friendship to his dreams of becoming either a veterinarian or a professional baseball player. Lily was more interested in the hiking trails, and we took several long walks together, discussing her plans for high school and her growing interest in environmental science. Timothy and I found a comfortable rhythm of shared activities and independent time. We fished together early in the mornings, worked together on small maintenance projects around the cabin, and spent evenings by the fire talking about topics that had nothing to do with family tensions or unresolved issues. Catherine seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. Without the pressure of managing family dynamics in her own home, she was able to enjoy the vacation and appreciate having additional adult help with the children's activities. On my last evening at the lake, as we were sitting around the fire after the children had gone to bed, Timothy brought up the subject that had been underlying all our interactions for the past 8 months. "Dad, I owe you an apology." I looked at him across the fire, waiting. I've been thinking about last Thanksgiving and about all the ways our relationship had already become unbalanced before that. You were right when you said I'd stopped really including you in our lives. I'd started thinking of you as someone we needed to accommodate rather than someone we genuinely wanted to spend time with. Thank you for saying that. I think I was scared, he continued. Scared of you getting older, scared of becoming responsible for your care, scared of the kids seeing you decline. So I started pulling back, creating distance as a kind of protection. Protection for whom? For all of us, I thought, but mostly for me. I didn't want to face the reality of your aging, so I started treating you like you were already diminished. It was a painful admission, but also a necessary one. Timothy was acknowledging something that many adult children struggle with: the difficulty of watching parents age, the temptation to withdraw rather than engage with the realities of growing older. Timothy, I'm 73 years old. My body isn't what it used to be, and someday my mind probably won't be either, but I'm not diminished. I'm not irrelevant. I'm not a burden to be managed. I know that now. Seeing you at Sunset Manor, seeing how engaged you are with your new life, how much the kids enjoyed spending time with you there, it made me realize that I'd been creating problems that didn't exist. Catherine spoke up for the first time during this conversation. "Harold, I owe you an apology too. I let my anxiety about family dynamics influence decisions that weren't mine to make. When Timothy suggested keeping Thanksgiving small, I should have questioned whether that was fair or necessary. Thank you, Catherine. But I want you both to understand something important." They waited. "I'm not angry about what happened. I was hurt and I was disappointed, but I wasn't angry. What happened forced me to make changes that have ultimately been very positive for my life. I've built new friendships, discovered new interests, and learned to live independently in ways that I hadn't expected." "Are you saying you're glad we excluded you?" Timothy asked, confusion clear in his voice. "I'm saying that sometimes difficult experiences lead to necessary changes. If you hadn't forced me to examine my living situation and my social dependencies, I might have continued in patterns that weren't serving anyone well." We talked until late that night, working through months of misunderstanding and hurt feelings. But more importantly, we talked about the future, about what kind of relationship we wanted to have, about how to balance inclusion with independence, about how to maintain family connections without falling back into unhealthy patterns. When I returned to Sunset Manor, I felt a sense of resolution that had been missing for months. Not because all our problems had been solved, but because we'd all acknowledged the problems honestly and committed to working on them differently. The monthly visits from Lily and Benjamin continued, and they became highlights of my social calendar. But now they were supplemented by occasional family dinners, holiday celebrations that included me naturally rather than reluctantly, and regular phone calls that felt genuine rather than obligatory. More importantly, Timothy and Catherine began to see me as a resource rather than a responsibility. When Lily was struggling with a particularly challenging math concept, Timothy asked if I'd be willing to work with her. When Benjamin expressed interest in learning about woodworking, they arranged for him to spend additional time in the workshop at Sunset Manor with Walter and me. The education trusts I'd established remained in place and unchanged. That decision had been about more than family dynamics. It had been about ensuring that my grandchildren would have opportunities regardless of economic changes or family circumstances. But I did revise my will slightly, increasing Timothy's inheritance to reflect our improved relationship while still maintaining my commitment to charitable giving. By autumn, our new patterns felt natural rather than forced. When Timothy called to ask about Thanksgiving plans, the conversation was straightforward and inclusive. "Dad, we're planning to have Thanksgiving at our house this year like we used to. Would you like to join us?" "I'd love to." "What can I bring? What would you like to bring?" It was a small change in phrasing, but it reflected a larger shift in perspective. Instead of being assigned a role in their celebration, I was being asked to participate as an equal contributor. "I'd like to make your mother's stuffing, if that's all right, and maybe her cranberry sauce." "That sounds perfect. The kids have been asking about Grandma's recipes." This Thanksgiving was different from all the previous ones, but different in positive ways. The conversation was more natural, the inclusion more genuine, the appreciation more apparent. Lily helped me in the kitchen, asking questions about her grandmother's cooking techniques and writing down the recipes in a notebook she'd brought specifically for that purpose. Benjamin spent most of the morning telling me about the birdhouse project he'd completed in the workshop, complete with technical specifications and design modifications he'd made to improve functionality. Timothy and Catherine seemed more relaxed, more genuinely pleased to have me there, less burdened by obligation or guilt. The dinner itself was delicious, the conversation was engaging, and the sense of family connection felt authentic rather than manufactured. After dinner, as we were cleaning up, Lily asked me a question that demonstrated how much she'd matured over the past year. "Grandpa, are you happy with how things worked out, with moving to Sunset Manor and everything?" Sophisticated question from a 13-year-old, one that showed she'd been thinking about family dynamics and relationship changes in ways that went beyond simple disappointment about altered traditions. "Yes, sweetheart, I am. Sometimes changes that seem difficult at first lead to better situations for everyone. You think you'll ever move back to a regular house? I don't think so. I really like the community at Sunset Manor. I've made good friends there, and I like being part of a place where everyone is dealing with similar life transitions. But you're not too far away for visits." "Exactly. Close enough for regular visits, far enough away to maintain independence." That evening, as I was preparing to drive back to Sunset Manor, Timothy walked me to my car. "Dad, I want you to know that this felt right today. Natural, like we found our way back to being a family, but in a better way. I think we did. We're going to be okay, all of us." I looked at my son, this man who'd hurt me deeply, but who'd also been brave enough to acknowledge his mistakes and work to correct them, and felt a profound sense of peace about our relationship. "We're going to be fine, Timothy. We've learned some hard lessons about taking each other for granted, about making assumptions about what other people need or want. But we've also learned that relationships can be repaired if everyone is willing to be honest about what went wrong. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son." As I drove back to Sunset Manor that evening, I reflected on the year that had passed since that devastating phone call about Thanksgiving plans. So much had changed my living situation, my social circle, my daily routines, my expectations about family relationships, but the most important change had been in my understanding of dignity and self-respect. I'd learned that you don't maintain relationships by making yourself small, by accepting exclusion, by waiting patiently for inclusion that might never come. You maintain relationships by being clear about your own worth, by building a life that's fulfilling on its own terms, and by refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your value as a person. The financial changes I'd made, the education trusts, the charitable bequests, the reduced inheritance remained in place. Not as punishment, but as recognition that security and dignity come from independence, not from depending on other people's good intentions or guilty consciences. My grandchildren would graduate from college debt-free, able to pursue their dreams without financial constraints. Worthy causes would benefit from resources that Margaret and I had accumulated through decades of hard work and careful saving. Timothy would inherit enough to know he wasn't forgotten, but not enough to regret the choices he'd made or to feel entitled to make similar choices in the future. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's possible to love people deeply while still maintaining boundaries that protect your own well-being. You can forgive without forgetting. You can rebuild relationships without pretending that hurtful actions didn't have consequences. As I pulled into the parking lot at Sunset Manor, I could see lights on in the community room, where Ruth and several other residents were probably playing cards or working on the quilting project that had become popular over the past few months. My apartment was waiting for me, comfortable and peaceful, filled with books I wanted to read and projects I wanted to complete. Tomorrow I would work in the garden, help Walter with the woodworking class he taught twice a week, attend the current events discussion group that had become one of my favorite weekly activities. I would live the life I'd built for myself, full, engaging, and meaningful on its own terms. And next weekend, Lily and Benjamin would visit, and we would work on their latest school projects, take walks through the gardens, and share stories. That would become part of their memories of their grandfather, not the grandfather who waited quietly in the background, hoping for inclusion, but the grandfather who lived fully and welcomed them into his life with joy and confidence. The empty chair that had once symbolized my exclusion had been replaced by a full life that made room for family connection without depending on it for meaning or validation. And that, I realized as I unlocked my apartment door and turned on the lights, was the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give to people you love is the example of living well without them, of building a life so rich and fulfilling that their presence becomes a joy rather than a necessity. When you stop making other people responsible for your happiness, you give them the freedom to love you authentically rather than obligatorily. The story of my 73rd year wasn't ultimately about family betrayal or financial consequences or the satisfaction of proving a point. It was about discovering that dignity and self-respect aren't just abstract concepts, they're practical life skills that can transform your relationships, your daily experiences, and your sense of purpose. And as I settled into my comfortable chair with a cup of tea and a book I'd been looking forward to reading, I felt grateful for every difficult moment that had led me to this understanding. Sometimes the most painful experiences teach us the most valuable lessons about how to live well, how to love wisely, and how to age with grace and dignity. The phone rang just as I was getting ready for bed. It was Benjamin calling to thank me for the day and to tell me about the story he was writing for school about his grandfather who lived in a place with the most amazing gardens and the coolest workshop and the nicest friends. "Grandpa," he said as we were saying good night, "I'm really glad you live where you live. It's the perfect place for you. Thank you." "Sweetheart, I think so too." And as I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I reflected on the truth that it had taken me 73 years to fully understand. The perfect place for you is anywhere you choose to build a life worth living, surrounded by people who value your presence rather than merely tolerating it. Sometimes the most devastating words, or keeping it small, become the catalyst for the most transformative changes. And sometimes the empty chair at one table leads to a full life at another.